Here now to discuss Carrie Severino. She's a former clerk for Justice Thomas, also current Judicial Crisis Network Chief Counsel. Carrie, let's talk about Justice Kavanaugh. He started hiring some folks today. He's putting his team together, and there's a lot of speculation on what kind of a justice he will be.
Yeah, I mean, he had to have provisional clerks hired just to get ready because he starts hearing cases on Tuesday, tomorrow. So it's getting a lot up to speed. So he already had his clerks kind of waiting in the wings, ready to go. And this is going to be the first time in history that any Supreme Court justice has all 4 female clerks. That'll be exciting to see. Even someone like Justice Ginsburg has not done that before. So that's really in keeping with his pattern. He feels very strongly about encouraging women and minorities to get into clerking, and it's a good leg up in the legal field. So he's putting his money where his mouth is, per se.
Carrie, you spent time with Justice Thomas. Some speculation, some people thinking out loud, maybe the process, maybe as grueling and as vitriolic as this process was, that something could have occurred within Brett Kavanaugh that it could actually influence his decisions from here on out. Is there any chance of that?
Look, he's someone who has been on the bench for 12 years. He's already hit his stride, really. I don't think you're going to see this affect him, and that's great news because when you look at his 300-plus opinions so far, it's a very reasoned, careful jurisprudence. He's very clear about sticking with the original understanding of the Constitution, sticking with the text of the laws, trying his very hardest not to let politics get in there and be very even-handed. That's why you had people like Obama's Solicitor General Don Verrilli stepping out and saying he'd be great on the court. Lisa Blatt, a liberal feminist, the woman who's argued the most cases before the Supreme Court, she testified for him. Akhil Amar, a Yale law professor as well. So all of these are people who really respect his judicial approach. It'll be the same going forward, very even-handed, but connected to the text of the law.
Real quick, Harry, the 5-4 looks like the balance of the court. A lot of people are concerned, the politicization of the Supreme Court. Do you see it that way?
I think it's people who are trying to make a pitch to say, oh, no, I want the courts to shift back to the left more. Look, guys, we have someone here who's going to follow the Constitution and the law. If that means it's a law that's a liberal law, he'll apply the text of that just like a conservative law. But I don't think he's going to be susceptible to those arguments. What will help the integrity of the court the most is someone who's faithful to that oath that he took on Saturday and that he's taking again tonight at the White House. I'm excited. I'm going to be heading to there shortly to watch that. If he's faithful to that oath to the Constitution, that's the best recipe for depoliticizing the court.
Thank you very much, Carrie. We, by the way, appreciate you helping us with this throughout the entire saga.
Thanks.
We appreciate it. Thanks.
So where does Kavanaugh stand on the big issues expected to come before the justices? Joining us now, Justin Walker, a former Kavanaugh clerk. It's a big question, but can you generalize? Where does he stand?
Well, John, if there's one thing that's clear from Judge Kavanaugh's 12 years on the second most important court in the country, it's that he's very faithful to principles like textualism and originalism. And what that means is that he doesn't think it's the judge's job to make up the law. It's the judge's job to go where the text of the law leads. And that's what I expect him to do on the Supreme Court.
So Congress is in charge of passing the laws and enacting them, and the courts are to interpret what the Congress wants to do.
That's right. So let me give you an example. Sometimes Congress will allow an agency to take action and regulate in a significant way, but sometimes agencies try to regulate in an even more significant way than they have the authority to do. Now, for decades, courts have been pretty deferential to agencies, and the result has been a $2 trillion annual regulatory burden on the American people and on the American economy. I think Justice Kavanaugh will be among other justices on the court who's skeptical of allowing agencies to do things that Congress has not authorized the agencies to do.
You watched the hearings, I'm sure. You heard a lot of mud being thrown at your former boss. Tell us about the guy you know.
Well, the guy I know is one of the most thoughtful, down-to-earth, brilliant lawyers that I've ever met. He's also a person whose word I trust absolutely, without reservation, without any kind of qualification. And I'm very happy that he's on the Supreme Court. I regret that he had to endure a 100-day process that was vicious, that was search and destroy, that saw some of his opponents breaking every rule in the book. And I'm glad that when he had a chance at his final hearing to show outrage for an outrageous process, that he showed the outrage he was feeling and that a lot of us were feeling.
What about the charge, though, that he became too political, too partisan in answering the charges of Christine Blasey Ford?
I think all Judge Kavanaugh did was call out the political, vicious search and destroy tactics that were being used against him. And he did that in his role as a nominee. I think his role now is as a justice, to go where the law leads without any passion or prejudice for a particular party or a particular policy outcome. That's what he did for 12 years on the D.C. Circuit, and I'm sure that's what he's going to do on the Supreme Court.
Here's something from the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed piece about what they see as being at stake here. It says the ugly Kavanaugh confirmation has awakened many complacent Republicans to the methods of the American left. Those methods will be in charge if Democrats control Congress. Should Democrats control Congress, they are talking about the possibility of impeaching your former boss. What do you think about that?
You know, I still have enough optimism about people left, right, and center to think that they won't go to that extreme. But I do have to say that, you know, maybe my optimism is not well placed. This is a process that saw allegations of witness tampering by people who were opposed to Kavanaugh. It saw the one and only Michael Avenatti. It saw leaks of Dr. Ford's name against her will. So it saw a lot of dirty tricks used against Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh. I'm hopeful that the next kind of breaking of the rule and breaking of the norms will not include an attempt to impeach.
Jonathan Turley is a noted legal authority. He says that Justice Kavanaugh is going to have a huge impact on the court right away. Listen to this.
I think Kavanaugh was viewed as a long-term investment because of his age, but he's going to have some pretty short-term returns. I mean, this docket is designed, it seems, for Kavanaugh.
What do you think about that? A docket designed for Brett Kavanaugh?
Well, I think that I would be a little bit cautious about overstating the impact of this nomination. Remember, Kavanaugh replaces Anthony Kennedy, who was probably one of the 10 most conservative justices of the past 70 years, and who voted with the conservatives in every 5-4 case last year. Now, having said that, Justice Kavanaugh is going to be faithful to textualism and originalism. He's going to be there for 10 or 20 years. And this new makeup of the Supreme Court, a solid majority that will be faithful to conservative legal principles, is quite a legacy for people like President Trump and for Senator Mitch McConnell, who was the only person at the center of the Garland, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh nominations. He prevailed in all three of those, and the court looks the way it does in part because of Senator Mitch McConnell.
You're a young man. You're obviously a lawyer or working to be one. Would you want to be nominated for a Supreme Court position, having just seen what Brett Kavanaugh went through?
Well, it's nice of you to call me a lawyer. I'm a law professor, so I think that means I'm a recovering lawyer. But you know, I think that anybody who's nominated would find it to be an honor. On the other hand, you know, this process of leaks and dirty tricks, protesters yelling murderer, murderer, senators like Cory Booker calling you evil and saying that your supporters are accomplices of evil. You know, this is not a process I would wish on my worst enemy, but I am glad that at the end of this very ugly process, Justice Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court where he belongs.
Well, it's good to get your take as a guy who knows him well and worked for him. Thanks very much for your expertise.
Thanks, John.
To read on all of these fast-moving developments, from the former law clerk to Justice Samuel Alito, Barbara Smith. Barbara, very good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, nothing like a baptism by fire, I guess. Get right into it. Here, the first case, and among many, it certainly gets off some of the distractions the judges had to deal with prior. How do you think he is going to fit in with the other 8 justices?
Well, of course, Justice Kavanaugh has been a judge for 12 years, so he knows quite well how to participate actively in oral argument and ask helpful questions. Of course, the Supreme Court is one of the few branches of government that I think thinks long and hard and respectfully about important legal questions, and he will fit right in with that tradition. He's a well-renowned scholar, and he's also a very sort of respectful and thoughtful jurist. So I imagine that he will have an easy time transitioning to First Street.
Is he one to pepper with questions versus, let's say, a Clarence Thomas who stays largely silent?
He's been relatively active on the Court of Appeals, and he tends to ask questions that I think, move the ball forward in argument. He doesn't talk just for the sake of hearing himself talk, but he will ask sort of helpful questions that go straight to the heart of the case. So I expect him to continue to participate actively in oral argument going forward.
So much has been made over the fact that he would be the swing vote, the conservative vote, to be the capper on this conservative majority. But I think, as you had reminded me when we last chatted, it doesn't always work out that way. There are very few 5-4 decisions on the court anyway. And they ultimately are not sort of lined up along, political, viewpoints, right?
Well, that's right. So, for example, in criminal cases, you may often see so-called conservative justices voting for criminal defendants in ways that sort of fracture the right side of the court. So someone like Justice Alito may vote one way and a Justice Thomas may vote another. I don't think it's fair to say that the justices are partisan, because they're really not. They think long and hard about the legal questions that are before them, sort of whether or not they might agree with the legal outcome. The goal is to reach the outcome that the law requires.
Is there pressure, especially after a contentious nomination, as was Brett Kavanaugh's, that he is very aware of those on the left who are leery of him, very aware of those on the right who think he's a rock star, so he wants to rebel from being typecast that way? How does that work?
Well, I certainly hope not. I think one of the great things about our, independent judiciary is the fact that justices, are insulated from those sort of political considerations. That's why we give them life tenure. That's why we make it very hard to remove judges and justices.
Well, no, the only reason why I mentioned it, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. That's my fault, certainly not yours, is David Souter ended up being the polar opposite of what George Bush Sr. thought he'd be, right?
Sure. And of course, now we have a very much more thorough vetting process, I think, on both the left and the right. People are sensitive to sort of wanting to know what they're getting out of justices. And I think with, Justice Kavanaugh and his 12-year record on the bench and his many years of public service before that, you do know what you're getting with him. And I would expect him to continue to be the type of man and the type of judge that he's been in the past.
This is outside your purview, so you can ignore this. But the timing of Nikki Haley's resignation today as our UN ambassador, after the whole Kavanaugh thing was settled, what did you make of that? Or was there a connection?
Well, it certainly says to me that the Senate Judiciary Committee's work never ends. I'm sure they will turn shortly to the nomination and confirmation process for whomever will replace her. And, the political process chugs along.
Indeed it does. That was well put, Barbara Smith. Thank you.